know or you don't know, or is it like, or some of you are sitting over there says, why in the world do I need to study ancient Samaritans?
Everyone needs to know their history.
Everyone needs to know their history. Okay, so it is. This is a part of our history. It is a part of who you are, whether you like it or not. Because every time a person says something about Samaritans, you actually want to know what that means. Besides the fact that this is some ministry that Billy Graham runs or something like that, I know, or not his name. His son's name. Like he's not running it anymore. So like his son took it over, or so like there's all these different things. So my question is like when you encounter Samaritans in the Bible, when you encounter them in the New Testament, do you actually understand who they are, what they do, what makes them tick? I am going to get sort of say as we progress in this teaching, I am going to get in the conversation that Yeshua had with Samaritan woman, which is really you're actually only going to understand that conversation if you know something about Samaritans. Okay, so just like if you've never seen I Love Lucy, you're not going to understand the intro to my drosh. And my sermon is going to land flat on you too because you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Context, background makes a big difference, right? Because if you're the only person in the room who have no idea what's going on, guess what? Most people, when they read the New Testament, they encounter Samaritans, they have no idea what's going on because they never met one. They don't know what they like. And if they bumped into one on the street, they wouldn't know they did. So I was riding in the car with my kids, and they were asking them, like, if Samaritans look differently today. And I said, when we go to Israel, hopefully we get to meet some. Yes, they do look differently today. But 2,000 years ago, they actually didn't look that different from an average Jew, which is why they could blend in, and nobody kind of knew who they were. There was a lot of back and forth between Jews and Samaritans in antiquity, and the reason is because they were equal in population, Josephus says, to Jewish population in that time, 2,000 years ago. Today, they're less than 1,000, right? So we're talking about a community that's almost gone. And the likelihood of you actually meeting a Samaritan, unless you go to seek them out, is not very high, okay? But, we're small people and they're tiny people in that sense. But you see what happened with their community. So it just shrunk to that level. So yet still, they're on the pages of history. All these books that we read, all these texts that we encounter, they're there. And they're in rabbinic literature as well. If you think you're going to make sense of rabbinic literature without really knowing something more about Samaritans, interactions between them and Jews, it would be very difficult to make sense. So in fact, I'm going to get into rabbinic literature today. So let me refresh this a little bit. Samaritans, I said last time, they consider only the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, to be as a sacred revelation from God. So they're a unique Jewish community that just sticks to the Torah only, 5 books only. That makes sense because if you remember the history, the prophets became a collection of special scrolls that Jews started to read after the days of Ezra, after the days of Nehemiah. And if you think about it, at that point, by then, Samaria was already dominated by outsiders, people who came from Babylon, and the remnants of Ephraim and Asher, those tribes that were there, they would have felt completely alienated and set apart and separated from the Jews of that day who were living in Jerusalem. They already had a parallel culture, essentially, kind of moving in its own direction. So imagine, why would they not read Psalms or prophets or anything like that? Well, because at that point, they've already formed their own unique religion. And so to join the religion of the Jews would be kind of to try to be like the Jews, and they already have their own unique identity going. So it's kind of competing with them at that point. So it becomes an issue of separatism and pride and all sorts of things. The split has already happened. So since deep antiquity, Judeans, unlike the Samaritans, they acquired many more sacred books besides the Torah. We have the prophets, the Psalms, Proverbs. We read them all the time. We have Kings, Chronicles, all these books. All of them came to be after the split between the north and the south, you see? And that's why Samaritans are unique. Because essentially, if that is what you understand, that in the 1st century CE, Samaritans embraced some, but not all of the spiritual ideas the Jews did. Why? Because a lot of those spiritual ideas came from places in holy books which they actually did not share with the Jews. They had a different Bible, okay? So to compare today, the modern day comparison, for example, Mormons and Christians, Mormons and Baptists, they embrace some of the same ideas, but not all. Why? Because they actually have different Bibles. Make sense? So because they have different Bibles, they have different spirituality. Because of different spirituality, they have different ritual. Because they have different ritual, they have different worship, and so on and so forth. So would it be likely that a Mormon and the Baptists get together and say, let's have a wonderful, happy union. Not likely, because one of them is going to say, I want to go this way, and the other one's going to say, no, I want to go that way. And so they're not going to get along, even though there's a lot of overlap between them. So this is kind of in that way. The communities have split apart and drifted in their own directions and developed their own alternative ways of spiritual meaning in life. And part of it is the fact that they had a different Bible. So the Samaritan Torah, by the way, and if you haven't seen one, that's what's flashing in the pictures before you. It differs in some details from the text that Judeans used. I have a text of Samaritan Torah, and a lot of times I like to compare it with what's in traditional text that I use all the time. It does have, in the version of Ten Commandments, actually tells the Samaritan Torah actually to worship on Mount Gerizim. It's in the Ten Commandments. So you shouldn't be surprised why they're really big on Mount Gerizim, because in their Ten Commandments, it doesn't just tell them that you should worship God, but it tells them where. It tells them the spot. So, like I said, Samaritan Torah is a little bit different. There are some differences. And so Jews have a different tradition. To us, Mount Gerizim does not have that kind of a meaning. So, for example, you may be familiar with the Jewish tradition that Abraham bound Isaac on top of Mount Moriah, right? When we talk about one of the most meaningful passages that we read in the Torah, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, and we do this all the time devotionally, right? We like that passage. It speaks to us on a very gut level. Well, we believe that happened in Mount Moriah, Judea. That means Jerusalem. That means top of the Temple Mount. Well, guess what? To Samaritans, that happened on Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim is where Abraham stretched out his hand, right? That in their tradition, that's where that important part of history happened. So they believe, for example, that Beit El is where Jacob had the famous dream of angels ascending, descending, right? They believe that it's Mount Gerizim, actually, right there, which Beit El is right around the corner. We still have a place called Beit El. It is an actual geographical location which we still recognize and honor, and there are some archaeological ruins on there. But we believe that that's where it happened, and they believe it happened on Mount Gerizim. So a lot of things happen on Mount Gerizim. But for Jewish tradition, Judeans, everything happened on top of Mount Moriah or somewhere else. So we keep pushing things toward that place where the temple dwelled, right? The ancient place that God chose for his glory to dwell, and they just keep pushing everything to Mount Gerizim. To them, that's the most important mountain. And of course, they live right at the foot of Mount Gerizim, so it makes sense. Maybe it was Mount Gerizim. So we don't know. Well, all important things happen to them on Mount Gerizim. You see, you have to appreciate that we all have lore. We all have stories, right? And we all build our identity on lore and stories. Well, their story includes Mount Gerizim a lot. So here's what Samaritan language actually looks like. Samaritans still use a very, very ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, which is influenced by the Phoenician writing system, which was developed. So Canaanites, Phoenicians, that's what it all looked like. In fact, Paleo-Hebrew looks a little bit like that. If you ever encountered Paleo-Hebrew text, it looks kind of sort of like that. Now, Judeans transitioned from Paleo-Hebrew to what we call Square Hebrew script, which was influenced by the Persians and Babylonians. So we kind of learned a little bit of how they write their letters, and we say that really looks good. So we copied that, So thank God we don't write like the Egyptians. Otherwise, we'd be drawing pictures of people doing things, right? we came up with these letters, and a lot of it is due to the fact that Persians and Babylonians came to conquer us, and that changed the Hebrew language. So when Ezra and Nehemiah come back, they bring back this new version of Hebrew with them. But guess what? The Samaritans then never left, right? So what do they stick with? The old stuff. And that's why their Hebrew looks like that. And their Torah is actually written in that kind of a script. So because the changes that took place with the rest of the Israelite community, all the other tribes essentially, happened in that pivotal moment with Persia and Babylon and captivity and bondage. So since the ancient days, basically Judeans and Samaritans have always differed on different understanding of Torah. They have different passages, and there's differences in text a little bit, and there's difference of halacha, okay? For example, Judean Israelites believed that a levirate marriage was allowed with any childless widow. You know the law in the Torah. It says if your brother dies, he left no children, you're supposed to marry his wife and give him children. You're supposed to give him offspring. We get the book of Ruth out of that, right? So that's a levirate law. I mean, it's very kind of right there, buried in the Torah. I know it's weird and strange for us, but We don't think about things like inheritance and land holdings and things like that today, so we don't have to worry about these things. But levirate marriage is a very real thing. Well, Samaritans also believe in levirate marriage, but they maintain that the levirate marriage should only occur if the widow's marriage was never actually consummated. Make it a very, very narrow exception. How would the widow's marriage never be consummated? Because you have to remember that the Jewish wedding ceremony and the nuptials, the way they work, you can be betrothed, and that pretty much counts as being married. And if your husband-to-be dies in war, or gets killed by robbers, or something happens, or he just has a heart attack, you were technically married, and now you're a widow. But your husband is gone, and so you were married, but you were never consummated, and so now it becomes the obligation of his brother to take you as a bride. Well, guess what? Samaritans had a very narrow definition of what that should look like, and that's where they differed with Judeans. So there's a number of differences in halacha. There's a number of differences of how the Samaritans apply their laws and interpret their Torah, and how they actually practice it in their daily life. And that's really where that divergence came, because each community developed in a parallel way. If you think about it, ancient Samaritans and Judean Israelites moved in very parallel ways, but they had different trajectories. It's like they just went like that. Imagine the road forking, and they're still kind of going in the same direction, but they're two separate roads. And the further they moved, the further they drifted apart. And when we get to the modern day, the Samaritans are very, very different from ancient Israelites. When we look at the antiquity, they're not quite as stark difference. The difference is way less, because a lot has happened, in the last few thousand years. So Samaritans, by the way, they use the solar calendar, while most Judeans agreed on the use of the lunar calendar, which is why their holidays did not overlap. Remember I told you a story about them going to the Passover in Jerusalem and ruining it for the Jews? Because they believed deep in their heart that the Jews were wrong, celebrating Passover on the wrong day. So they were going to fix that problem by ruining their Passover sacrifices, defiling the temple. So I told you that story for a reason. Because this really stems from the fact that they argue over calendars all the time. They don't render days the same way. So ancient Samaritans, they commemorated 7 biblical feasts of Israel, of course. Why? Because they're in the Torah. They're in the books of Moses right there. While Jews in Judea developed other celebrations throughout history, such as, for example, Hanukkah and Purim. And they did all kinds of things that Samaritans really had nothing to do with, because they have had a parallel history that did not include those same experiences. And therefore, they didn't really mean much to them. So as you can imagine, that causes a development of these two different religions. Now I want to talk a little bit about calendars. Calendar was really an issue of sharp disagreement between Jewish groups in antiquity. I don't realize how big of a problem this was, but the current Jewish calendar that we use today is actually what we can call a lunisolar calendar. It really is a hybrid of two things. Right, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. It actually gets quite complicated. I don't want to get into it, because if you're going to study the calendar, you'll realize that you're going to need a math degree to figure this out. And you'll need also to know Hebrew really well, especially ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. Otherwise, it's impossible to figure this out. But basically, months are counted using the moon, right? So every time new moon comes out, that means new month, right? Well, that's not how months on our solar calendar are counted. But on a lunar calendar, that's how they count it. But the years are based on the sun. Why? Because the weather is based on the sun, right? Climate, the changes that happen are based on the sun. And all the Jewish festivals are agriculturally tied. So I cannot have a spring month in the middle of a summer. Why? Because I actually have commandments to bring certain kinds of crops which are not going to be ripening now because they've already ripened back then. So if my seasons do not correlate to my months, and God tells me on this month, on such and such a day, do this, and I can't, why? Because my seasons have shifted, then I'm in trouble. So you understand that while our world really runs through the sun, because the sun is what warms us up and makes the seasons, God told us use the moon to count months. So we're in this interesting situation. And basically what happened is people had these alternative calendars. And because the seasons follow the sun, basically our solution, and that's the solution that was come up basically in the 4th century, is a leap year. So we have a leap year every 7th year in the 19-year cycle. So there's a certain consecutive progression of how leap years work. on the Jewish calendar, but basically you get a 13th month added to your calendar. You have Adar 2. We're in the leap year right now. We have Adar 2, but the cycle is actually organized in kind of like in a very interesting way. But what it does, it adjusts for the differences in the moon and the sun cycles. And essentially, every few years you have a reset. And that's why you could see the seasons slowly move. Like some years Hanukkah comes early, other years Hanukkah comes late, some years Passover comes early, another year, and it just moves, and then there's a bump. Moves, and then there's a bump. So essentially, the calendar is just, if you are following the solar calendar and trying to follow Jewish calendar, you constantly are trying to figure out which day is when based on the Jewish calendar versus the rest of the world. So, and that's really why. So because it's a combination, it's a lunisolar calendar. Now, today's Jewish calendar was calculated and started basically around the 4th century CE. So by the 5th century CE, and it's traditionally credited to Hillel II. He's one of the elders that supposedly developed the calendar. So prior to that, system was not quite as organized. Basically, the days and the months and the years and everything was counted in a very manual fashion, and people actually counted the months by counting the moons, and they sanctified the moon. That's what they did, and the moon had to be witnessed. So if the witnesses see the moon in the sky and it's a new moon, they have to make it to the council. And they have to say, I saw the moon, and the other guy says, I saw the moon, I vouch for it, and then so they accept their word as the witnesses. Then the council says, therefore the new month has begun, and now, we have a new month. So imagine if the weather was not good, and it was cloudy, and they didn't see the moon. So you could see how that imprecise way of having to declare a new month by observation was really causing a little bit of a variance here and there.
Also why our new moon starts a day later than the Gentiles, because we have to see the sliver.
Right, we have to see the sliver, yeah. So there's all kinds of things in Jewish tradition when it comes to calendar that makes it incredibly complicated, okay? But we don't need to worry about that, because all we need to understand is the big picture of how it works, okay? And so what I want you to realize, because the system is so complicated, and people rarely agree on complicated matters, there were multiple alternative calendars that existed even among the Jews, and Samaritans, by the way, included. So, as best we know, the Pharisees, they used a lunar calendar, which means that the day begins at sunset and the year begins in the fall. That's how they rendered time. And the years are counted by the moon, and then manual adjustments are made. Basically very similar to what we're doing today on the Jewish calendar. However, the Sadducees used a solar lunar calendar, where the day begins at sunrise and the year begins in spring. Why? Because the Torah says spring is the beginning of years to you, right? The month of Nisan. So they're very biblical. So they have a slightly different system. So they render things differently. The Essenes followed a largely solar calendar, because remember, the Essenes are tied to the priestly movements. They're actually Sadducees, essentially, in many ways. But they have their own theology. They have their own ideas. So they used a largely solar calendar of 364 days. This is interesting, okay? And they grouped those years into 50-year cycles of jubilees, and they kind of counted everything that way. But it was very important to them that they had 26 orders of priests, because now you understand. So like how many weeks you have in the year, that's how many priests. So every priestly order serves for 2 weeks, and then they rotate out. And so to them, it was all about the temple. It was all about the priests. So the calendar was basically determined by the temple and the priestly orders. So Essenes had their own unique ideas about the calendar. So you have all these different movements in the first century actually disagreeing how everything should run. And guess what? Half the time they're fighting about it, and they're trying to stick it to each other. Which is why, like the Sadducees, if they run the temple, this is when the holidays are going to happen. And the Pharisees run the temple, this is when the holidays are going to happen. And then whichever group is not in power end up being really upset with the other group that sets the rules. And the groups change. And who holds the power changes all the time, because the political system is in turmoil. And there's all these alliances and people coming in power and promoting one group over the other. It's not a pretty picture, but
Israel hasn't changed.
Israel has not changed. If you watch the Knesset today, it's just kind of like, oh, let's make a coalition and let's make it difficult for these guys right there, because they're never going to vote with us anyway on anything anymore. So let's just put them in oblivion.
Have a prime minister and still don't have a government.
Right, and so in some ways, if you study the history, you understand why we are the way we are today. Okay, so. Now imagine the system, if you understand it. All these calculations could be very easily thrown off by noticing the new moon late. For example, like we said, I didn't see it, so I reported it late because I didn't see it. That would throw everything off. And then they would also alter the start of the Omer count. Remember, there was a disagreement between Pharisees and Sadducees when the Omer starts. Why? Because they misinterpreted the Torah of how they understand it. It says on the day after Shabbat. Well, guess what? Pharisees said it has to be on this day, and Sadducees says no, we have to wait for actual numerical Shabbat. Why? Because Pharisees said any holiday is a Shabbat, so it could be the day after the holiday. Okay, that's when they stamped the Omer. So today we count the Omer right after Pesach, right? But the Sadducees says, no, you actually have to wait for the Saturday to come, whenever that falls later on during the week of Matzot. And every year is going to be a different place. And then we start the Omer count. Well, guess what? If you change the Omer count, then you change Shavuot. If you change Shavuot, then you change Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. Everything falls out of proportion. So now you have this calendar that doesn't line up with everybody else. So guess what? There were some kinks in the system that didn't work, and people fought over calendar all the time. And Samaritans were in the middle of all that, which is why we read these stories about them being upset with Jews having a different calendar and not being in agreement. So I wanted to share a story with you from Mishnah. This is from Rosh Hashanah, Tractate Rosh Hashanah, so it's 2:1. That's the 2nd century CE document, and I want you to see the disagreement that is here. And Samaritans are right in the middle of it. So Mishnah writes, if the members of the Great Sanhedrin, so this is the Great Assembly, the Great Council in Jerusalem, are not familiar with that one who saw the new moon, they're talking about the witnesses coming forward and saying that, hey, I saw the new moon. They sent another with him to testify about him. The Mishnah adds, initially, the court would accept the testimony to determine the start of the month from any person. However, when the Bethusians corrupted the process by sending false witnesses to testify about the new moon, the sages instituted that they would accept this testimony only from those men familiar with them. So, you see what happens right here? I told you, Samaritans kind of try to mess up the Passover by spreading, person's bones all over their temple. Bethusians. Who are Bethusians? We studied Bethusians a little bit in the past. If you remember, they're Sadducees. They're it's a specific family within the Sadducee division. And so Bethusians, they were against following that calendar. So what they're going to do is they're going to send false witnesses to tell you, oh, we saw the moon. So then you assume that these are good Jews, and they're telling you the truth, and you say, all right, we're going to proclaim the new month based on the words of these witnesses, but the witnesses are false, because the Bethusians are trying to mess everything up for you. You see, this is what I call very spiteful Judaism, right? I cannot enjoy life until I messed it up for you. So they said, basically, they said, now we're not going to accept the testimony of just anyone coming forward. It has to be people we trust. They have to be the witnesses that we vetted. We know they're good. They're not agents of the Bethusians coming in and telling us nonsense. They didn't really see the moon. So we can't trust them because they're liars. So it says that, it continues. Initially, after the court sanctified the new month, they would light torches on the mountaintops from peak to another to signal the community in Babylonia that the month has been sanctified. Now remember, there's tons of Jews living in Babylon. They never left Babylon. They stayed in Babylon. And there's a massive Jewish community there. So how are they going to know when to start the new month unless somebody tells them? So they would light the torches, and on top of the mountain, basically, this big, huge fire. I kind of imagine the Lord of the Rings, right? It's a beacon, right? The Lord of the Rings. I'm thinking like Tolkien, it's the beacon. Like they would spread the news. The war is starting. Get your armies together. The Lord of the Rings. The same thing here. They would light this beacon, and this beacon would pass from one mountaintop to another mountaintop until, it says, until after the Samaritans, the Kutim, that's what they're called in Hebrew. Remember the Kuthians, Kutim. They corrupted and ruined this method by lighting torches at the wrong times to confuse the Jews. Then the sages instituted that messengers should go out to the diaspora. So we've come up with this nice idea of letting everybody know by using the beacons. But there's these people who basically don't agree with our calendar, so they're going to mess up our calendar. So they're going to set up false beacons at the wrong times, and our community is going to get the signal at the wrong time. And now the Jews in Babylon are going to be celebrating a holiday on a different day because we messed up their count because somebody sent the wrong signal. Do you see how this gets really messy with the calendars and how much fighting that was going on?
That's why, because of the messengers, That's why additional days were added to certain holidays, because they needed time to get there to get the work.
Exactly. So are you familiar with the custom that where the diaspora usually celebrates an extra day? Right, so we have a holiday in Israel, and it happens on this day, but outside of Israel, we actually celebrate it for an extra day. Why? Because of that lag with the messengers going back and forth, because we need to be sure. We need to know exactly. So even though today our calendar has actually been fixed, and it's a calculation, it's no longer based on, oh, I saw the moon, now let me testify to the court, and now let the court announce that the new month actually began, and now let's spread the news to everyone else. We're no longer relying on those means anymore, but the traditions actually still stick. Tradition, that's how the tradition gets started. Once you understand this is how far back some of these traditions that we have that we do. I mean, they go back thousands of years. So, and they're part of our history. So hopefully you can understand how this was really a messy, messy issue, the whole calendar business. And guess what? The Samaritans, they're in the middle of that. So tell me something. If this is the kind of mischief the Samaritans were causing to Jews, would there be reasons not to trust them, not to like them? Because if they're doing that on purpose, they're like, you're trying to keep on time, and they come and they rewind your clock, and you keep trusting your clock, and you're like, oh, but they changed the time. You didn't realize it because they messed with your stuff to just mess up your system. Like, why would people do that? Well, if that's the kind of things they do, then obviously there's a little bit of less goodwill towards them. Yeah, well, they're a fascinating community. They deserve the light and the sun, so they deserve their day in the sun, obviously. They're unique. They're unique. And they have some interesting claims to teach us still. Yeah, just leave our beacons alone, right? Don't change my clock.
Leave my stuff
All right. So this is a passage that I wanted to bring you for John 4. This is a familiar passage, hopefully. John 4 records the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. We finally got to it. But the question that I have to ask you is, what type of a Samaritan woman was this woman at the well? Because was she one of those foreign transplants who mixed with the locals? Remember I told you there's multiple types of Samaritans. Just because we all call them Samaritans, because we call all New Yorkers New Yorkers, right? What kind of a New Yorker are you? What kind of a Samaritan are you? Are you a local? Are you like a real local? Or are you one of those people who lately moved here from far away and brought some weird, strange customs and not really acculturated to what it really means to be? So what kind of a Samaritan is she? Is she one of those transplants mixed with locals? Is she one of those original Israelites, Ephraim and Menashe, who stubbornly stayed aloof and decided not to mix with these newcomers? I think the story actually gives us clues. If we read it carefully, we should be able to figure out what kind of an Samaritan Israelite she is. Because she is, she speaks for herself, actually. I love that story. So, John 4, verses 5 to 6. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. So the story gives us all kinds of details, and all of these details, by the way, are important. So let's jump into the first thing. He comes to a town in Samaria called Sychar. We don't really know where that town is anymore, but we know, it tells us, that it was near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph, and we know exactly where that is. We know that land. Jacob's well, we know where that is, exactly. We know where Jacob's well was because he tells us in the Torah where that well was dug. And some of the same towns and some of the same names are still there. So while we know where the village of Sychar was, we actually know that this was basically between Shechem and Nablus, just right there, in between. So probably this little village right there. And it says he was tired, so he sat down by the well. And it was about noon, and here comes this woman. The strange part of the story, of course, is because it's noontime. If you know anything about ancient culture, that was not the best time to go to the well. You came to the well in the morning, you came to the well in the evening. You did not go in the heat of the day, but this woman came in the noontime, which was good for Yeshua, because he was thirsty and tired. So the story goes. So far, what can we tell? She's in the right place. She's definitely in the right spot. She's in the ancestral land of Jacob. She's living in that same very spot. And the rest of their conversation is what actually going to tell us what she is. So many Judeans and Samaritans, we know that they stayed kind of clear of each other. We know that because, well, the Gospel of John tells us that. Some people would say they considered each other unclean, so sharing utensils would render both of them defiled. If Jesus drinks from the Samaritan jar, that jar may not be good anymore because now he's got Jewish cookies on it, and vice versa, by the way. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm using 4-year-old language here, but you get it. So how much did Samaritans and Jews really stay aloof from one another? And that's a question that I, as a historian, always ask. But I have these little stories, like the one in John, that tell me, that suggest at least these ideas. So I keep reading John 4. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And John tells us his disciples had gone into the town to buy food. So they're off to shop because besides being thirsty, they're also hungry. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And then John jumps in and tells us, "For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." So just a nice little parenthetical comment. So what are we supposed to do about that? Well, if we were just reading John, if this is all we know about Samaritans, we would just take it as it is. Samaritans, Jews don't really get along, don't share drinks, don't share cups for sure. She's going to tell him, "You have no cup, how are you going to drink? I can't give you mine." Things like that. So that's going to come up with a story. So my question, of course, is how much is this a real portrayal of history? Did Samaritans and Jews who really lived next door to each other, how much they didn't like each other if they stayed away to that degree? I mean, that's the question, because you have stories that are conflicting where Jesus actually goes to Samaritans and he says that he eats with them. In the end of the story, by the way, he stays with them for several days. And there's not a problem. And I have to wonder, if he was a good Jew, a righteous Jew, would that be okay? Because apparently he stayed with them actually for a few days. So I want to share with you a little bit of what I think is the confusion, and some of that confusion comes from various sources. One of them is the Gospel, and the other one is rabbinic literature. So ancient rabbis, in my opinion, were very divided on Samaritans. They were not always to be trusted. That much we catch on from rabbinic literature. For example, if the Samaritan witnessed something, if they were to be called to a court to be a witness, they would not be very readily believed. A lot of people believe that you could not be a Samaritan and witness in court because we can't trust these people, basically. But then, same exact verses in rabbinic writings will say that women are also not to be trusted. They're also not reliable witnesses in court. So even Jewish women. So then you realize it's really not ethnicity. It's just who do we deem credible, who do we not deem credible. So guess what? Samaritans, maybe not believable. I don't know how to answer that question besides the fact that it's out there. Okay, now on the other hand, and this is the other side of rabbinic literature that a lot of people do not know, they were always elevated above pagans because they actually did observe the commandments of Torah. And sometimes people, I would say, misrepresent and exaggerate the dislike of Samaritans by the rabbis. And I would honestly believe that it's maybe a part of that comes from Christian scholarship and Christian literature, because things are kind of, to me, obviously taken out of context. So you might hear, for example, someone say that Samaritans are unclean and their food is unclean. And then they will quote Mishnah. And Mishnah Shavit 8:10 says, "One who eats the food of Samaritans is if he eats pork." That's what it says. Wow. Okay? Look at this. It says, "Chochal pad kutnim," okay? And it says, "Kachal basar hazir." How you can translate that in any other way possible except if you eat what the Samaritans eat, it's like you're eating pork. Yeah. So that's clearly a derogatory statement. So basically the food of the Samaritans is like treif. You can't eat their food. It's polluted. It's awful. Now, it's true, Rabbi Eliezer might have actually said that. But what you have to understand is the context in which he said that. And this is where I think people take these little verses and just take them out of context and make them say what they say. But if you read the bigger passage, hopefully it will make sense to you. And I abbreviate it because it's actually a long discussion. So the little ellipses you see, it's where I took stuff out. But you'll still track with it. So the rabbis say, one might not buy slaves, land, or an unclean beast with a Shavit money. So they're talking about Shemitah. They're talking about the 7th year. They're talking about resources that come from the 7th year. Things that come from the things that belong to the 7th year. What's special about the 7th year? it belongs to the Lord. The land is supposed to lay still. You're not supposed to harvest. You're allowed to eat from the land, but you're not allowed to store things off that land. So that becomes an ethical issue of how much can we keep for ourselves to eat, how much can we store, how much we cannot. What if money comes to me, if I benefited from this produce that came from this field which is actually in its 7th year, can I use that? And so the rabbis get into technical issues and says you cannot buy land, you cannot buy slaves. It would be, you cannot buy this with a shavit money, okay? And it says one may not anoint vessels with the oil of the 7th year produce. So if I have an oil that was taken from the olives, which were in the 7th year, they were supposed to rest. But I'm allowed to use that oil, I'm just not allowed to store it. But if I took and I anointed vessels, I smeared oil on them, then those vessels are no good. You're not supposed to do that. And people would anoint vessels so they would actually keep form a little bit better. It's like a way of hermetically sealing it. So a hide, which they oiled with a 7th year oil. And if you understand anything about leather making, sometimes leather is very tough and needs to be softened, and people would use oil to soften the leather, okay? So a hide, which they oiled with a 7th year oil, Rabbi Eliezer says it must be burnt. Why? Because it's illegal. You're not supposed to use this oil in this way. It is not a legitimate way of using oil which was supposed to be consumed, but not used for durable goods. And then you continue benefiting from this oil for a long, long period of time. So they're saying, do not do that. And if you did that, that hide, that leather, it just needs to be burned. It needs to be destroyed because it's no good, because we're actually breaking Hashem's law by circumventing this. We're using this to our advantage in a way we shouldn't. So Rabbi Eliezer says, burn it. Then continues the conversation. Says, I won't tell you what Rabbi Eliezer actually said in this connection. And then he says, no, I will tell you. They also said in front of him, Rabbi Eliezer used to say, whoever eats the bread baked by a Samaritan is like the one who eats the flesh of a pig. Now, do you understand the context of this? He is not talking about that Samaritan food is no good. Samaritan food is no good only because they did not follow the year of the Shemitah the same way the Jews do. So just like the hide deserves to be burnt because it is illegitimately anointed by oil which should not be used, the same way the food of Samaritans becomes unusable as treif, because if you eat that food, you're benefiting from something you're not supposed to benefit from. Why? Because it's actually forbidden by the Torah. So the whole entire discussion actually is about protecting Jews from not accidentally overstepping these laws that have to do with the Shemitah. Really, that's what it has to do with this 7th year that is set aside as this special measure. And the rabbis are discussing that. In the middle of that, he mentions that, well, then eating foods for the Samaritans who do not follow this, then that is as good as treif. It's eating pig flesh. You might as well, and that, you understand, it's exaggeration, obviously. This is, if in rabbinic literature, people exaggerate. They just stretch things out. And so this is like Yeshua saying, if your eye offends you, poke it out. If your hand, arm offends you, cut it off. Because it's better for you to enter into life, without those parts than do that. So every rabbi exaggerates, and that's exactly what he's doing. He says, he just takes it and bends it too far. And then people will take that statement and they'll say, see what Jews think about Samaritans? It really has nothing to do with Samaritans. It really has to do with the fact that they don't follow the same rules. And we don't want to eat their food because we can't trust their food because they don't follow the same rules. Make sense?
Why wouldn't they follow the same rules when they follow the 5 books?
Because they have their own halacha. Remember, they have their own community leaders, and it's the community leaders who interpret the Torah, and they set in motion a whole set. The Torah cannot be just followed like that. You can't just apply it automatically. You always need a community to interpret it, and that's how it's been done in the Jewish community for ages. And that's why they don't have that. They're not going to follow the rabbinic rules because they have their own elders who interpret the Torah in their own way.
So this goes back to the previous weeks when you talked about an illegitimate high priest being set up in Samaria and the intermarriage and everything. So that's where that whole new set of authority has to be, that whole structure of authority has to be set up to validate that.
Pretty much. It's like this is no different than Catholics telling you that the Baptist communion is not valid. Do you understand? Yeah. I'll just bring it out to the world that maybe you're not more familiar with, away from the rabbis and Samaritans. The Catholic says you could take the communion in the Baptist church all you want. it doesn't do what it's supposed to do because it's not from us, and they don't follow our rules and don't follow our authority. They were not, blessed by us, and therefore it's all legitimate. You might as well. It's not the Eucharist. It means nothing. There's no magic. Yeah, that's it. It's gone. So do you understand? And the Baptists would say the same thing. They would reverse the same thing and then do it the opposite way. And the reason is because each community has their own authorities that set their own rules, and they all follow their own rules. And if they don't follow the rules, then they don't accept whatever the implications of those rules that come out.
I'm just going to say real quick, what I like about this part is that it shows the importance of context, because I like how you said, they take this one little bit. It's like with, well, I don't want to say anything. It's like, say, some religious leaders, they'll take one verse or something that Yeshua or someone said, and they'll go with it. But even my dad told me, read the next few verses afterwards and before. Otherwise, you're going to get a completely different story or meaning out of it. So when I'm looking at this, I see
it's like that, not just in the Bible. Your dad is a wise man, everything is in context. I hear you say something, and I just heard one sentence. If I don't understand the context in which you said that, I can solely misinterpret you. You could be talking about your frustration and say, I'm going to kill that guy. And I'm thinking, oh no, Benjamin's going to become a murderer. I better call the police. And it's a hyperbole, you're exaggerating, you're just mad, venting, whatever. And I'm thinking, oh, he's premeditating murder. And then they put me on the stand and I'm in court testifying, yes, I heard Benjamin say he was premeditating murder. Things like that. So you see how something innocent like that can be so twisted because I don't know the context. And you're right, context is important. And not just in the Bible, it's important in history as well, which is what I'm trying to give you by citing more of the text than just one little phrase. Yes?
One thing I think is interesting is that a lot of Judaisms, because there are a lot of Judaisms at the time, but a lot of the ones that kind of branched off and did their own thing and were going to, escape from the main authorities of Judaism to kind of, we're going to moon watch in our way, or we're going to, they didn't really survive, ultimately. And so I think that there's something to be said about a centralized authority, that a strong centralized authority that has smicha to decide on such matters, because these little branches just kind of go off and, you don't meet a lot of Essenes nowadays.
You don't meet Essenes.
No, you don't. Maybe
Ebionites are not running around. They may have websites on, but they're not the same Ebionites. They're not the same Ebionites that have been around the whole time. It's just, we don't have writings of Ebionites, we don't have their halacha, we just hear little bits and stories. There's a lot of movements that appear and disappear. And then they go into nothing. Like I said, Jews, we're small people, right? We're small people, but we're still around after all these thousands of years. So something we've got right. There's something that we're doing that right that keeps working, that God does not allow us to be wiped out. But then there's Karaites, It used to be in thousands and thousands and thousands. Where are Karaites? How many thousand Karaites there are today? You probably count them, they're not that many. And then there's all these movements like that. And they come up, they have their day in the sun, and then they disappear. And so, valid point, Rick. Maybe there's something to this whole centralized authority or consensus or a joint history where people not try to work against each other, but actually try to work together, which is what actually happened in Rabbinic Judaism. There was consolidation of multiple different movements into one whole. And that's what Mishnah a lot of times shows to us. Yes?
To follow up on that thought, it's like, there are a lot of people out there, myself included, who think that the regulation of kitniyot is stupid. But they'll still keep the regulation of kitniyot because that's what keeps you...
Because that's what keeps us a part of the community, rather than creating a dissent and starting a split off, right? So, there are things like that. And so, but we still have our own divisions, and there are lines we draw, right? But there's some things that we choose not to draw lines on, like kitniyot. Like, all right, fine, I will just stay away from the beans. Big deal. All right. So that's Mishnah. Now, I have some more examples for you to show to you where people kind of stick the feud between Jews and Samaritans into and take it out of context. But I'm not going to go there because that can make me run out of time. So I wanted to say that. I'll say that. Yes?
I need to make one more announcement about Passover before we all disperse.
Go ahead.
Okay. So Kim and I were just figuring out, because there are people who want to buy tickets for the Passover Seder already, so we just kind of sorted all that. We're going to do, for 2 weeks, just open